What if I told you Russia's invasion isn't stalling but growing? Right now, as you're watching this video, Russian forces are conducting their largest military operation in Europe since World War II. It's been 3 years since the invasion began, and contrary to what many predicted, Putin's war machine isn't slowing down. Western intelligence now reports record Russian troop levels. Over 620,000 Russian troops are now deployed in and around Ukraine, more than at any point since the conflict began. This isn't just about territory anymore. But this massive escalation raises a critical question. How did we get here? The evolution of Putin's war machine. Putin's original plan collapsed within days of the February 24, 2022 invasion. Russian forces positioned for what military planners called a rapid decapitation strike against Kiev were designed to topple the Ukrainian government before Western nations could respond effectively. The initial deployment of approximately 200,000 troops represented what Moscow believed would be sufficient for a quick victory. Fast forward to 2025, and the reality on the ground tells a completely different story. Current intelligence estimates placed Russian forces at over 620,000 personnel actively engaged in Ukrainian operations, representing the largest sustained military commitment Russia has made since the Soviet era. This massive escalation reveals how fundamentally Putin's strategy has evolved from the original invasion plan. The quick strike doctrine that characterized those first weeks has transformed into something entirely different. A prolonged territorial consolidation campaign that prioritizes holding ground over rapid advances. Russian military units that once focused on speed and mobility now spend months constructing elaborate trench systems and defensive positions. The shift represents a complete reversal of initial Russian military doctrine, which emphasized rapid combined arms operations designed to overwhelm enemy forces through superior coordination and firepower. The transformation became evident through multiple mobilization waves that began in September 2022. Russia's military structure changed from a predominantly professional force to one heavily dependent on conscripted personnel. The first mobilization officially called up 300,000 reservists, but subsequent waves expanded the number significantly. By 2024, Russia was recruiting approximately 30,000 new soldiers monthly through various programs, including volunteer contracts offering substantial financial incentives. These recruitment drives fundamentally alter the character of Russian forces from highly trained professional units to mass formations with varying levels of combat readiness. Western weapon deliveries to Ukraine forced Russia to abandon its preferred combined arms tactics. Early in the conflict, Russian forces attempted coordinated attacks using tanks, infantry, and artillery working together. However, the introduction of systems like Javelin anti-tank missiles, HIMARS rocket artillery, and various air defense platforms made these tactics prohibitively expensive. Russian commanders adapted by shifting to attritional warfare strategies that rely on overwhelming firepower rather than tactical sophistication. Artillery bombardments now precede most Russian operations, with some estimates suggesting Russia fires 10 times more shells than Ukrainian forces in contested areas. The construction of defensive fortifications across occupied territories provides the clearest evidence of Russia's long-term occupation plans. Satellite imagery reveals extensive trench networks, concrete barriers, and fortified positions stretching hundreds of kilometers across the front lines. These aren't temporary fighting positions, but permanent installations designed to withstand sustained attacks. The Surovikin Line, named after former Russian commander Sergei Surovikin, represents the most sophisticated defensive system built in Europe since World War II. Multiple defensive belts extend 20 to 30 kilometers deep in some areas, incorporating anti-tank ditches, minefields, and prepared artillery positions. Russia's defense industrial base underwent rapid expansion to sustain this prolonged conflict. Pre-war ammunition production levels proved insufficient within months of the invasion. Russian factories operating under wartime production schedules have tripled their output of artillery shells, with some facilities running continuous operations. The expansion includes converting civilian manufacturing facilities to military production, and establishing new supply chains with countries like North Korea and Iran. This industrial mobilization requires massive resource allocation and demonstrates Russia's commitment to sustaining operations indefinitely. The decision to maintain this enormous military commitment stems from how Putin's inner circle framed the conflict's importance. According to intercepted communications and defector testimonies, senior Russian officials convinced Putin that Ukraine represented an existential threat to Russian statehood rather than simply a territorial dispute. Security Council meetings in late 2022 reportedly emphasized that Western support for Ukraine aimed to fragment Russia itself. This framing transformed the conflict from a limited military operation into what Russian leadership views as a struggle for national survival. Russian domestic propaganda evolved to support this massive resource expenditure through careful messaging campaigns. State media shifted from portraying the operation as a limited intervention to describing it as a patriotic war against Western aggression. Television programming now regularly features segments explaining why the conflict requires total national commitment. Opinion polls, while their accuracy remains questionable under authoritarian conditions, suggest many Russians accept the narrative that the country faces an existential threat requiring unlimited resources. Regional administrators across Russia received directives to support military recruitment and production goals. Local governments now dedicate significant portions of their budgets to supporting military families and defense contractors. Some regions established quotas for voluntary military service, creating pressure on local officials to meet recruitment targets. This coordination between federal and regional authorities demonstrates how thoroughly the war effort has penetrated Russian governmental structures. Financial commitments reflect this comprehensive transformation. Russia's military budget increased by over 70% between 2022 and 2024, representing approximately 6% of gross domestic product. These expenditures cover not only direct military costs, but also payments to military families, veteran benefits, and industrial subsidies. The scale of financial commitment makes reversing course economically devastating, creating powerful incentives to continue operations regardless of battlefield outcomes. Putin's war machine has evolved into something far beyond what anyone anticipated in February 2022. The original limited military operation has become a comprehensive national effort involving every aspect of Russian society and government. But this transformation inside Russia represents only one piece of a much larger puzzle that has reshaped the entire world. The new geopolitical reality. The global order that existed on February 23, 2022 no longer exists. What began as a regional conflict between Russia and Ukraine triggered cascading changes across every continent that nobody anticipated. Strategic analysts who predicted limited regional impacts now acknowledge they fundamentally misunderstood how interconnected the modern world had become. The conflict exposed dependencies and relationships that transformed geopolitical calculations from Washington to Beijing to New Delhi. NATO expansion accelerated at unprecedented speed as Nordic neutrality disappeared overnight. Finland abandoned 75 years of careful neutrality and joined NATO in April 2023, followed by Sweden completing membership in March 2024. These additions fundamentally altered Northern European security architecture by extending NATO's eastern border by over 800 miles directly adjacent to Russia. The Baltic Sea transformed from a body of water where Russia controlled significant coastline to what military planners now call a NATO lake. Finnish membership brought 900 miles of new NATO territory along the Russian border, while Swedish membership provided strategic depth and advanced military capabilities, including sophisticated submarine warfare technology. European military spending underwent the most dramatic increase since the Cold War ended. Germany's defense budget expansion represents the most striking transformation, increasing from 47 billion euros in 2021 to over 85 billion euros by 2024. This reflects how thoroughly the war changed German strategic thinking about military preparedness. France allocated an additional 30 billion euros for military modernization programs between 2022 and 2025. Poland's defense spending reached 4% of GDP, making it NATO's highest spender relative to economic output. These increases funded new equipment purchases, expanded military personnel, and accelerated domestic defense production capabilities across European nations. China's relationship with both Russia and the West created a complex triangular dynamic that defied traditional alliance structures. Trade turnover between Russia and China reached a record $237 billion in 2023, representing a nearly 70% increase since 2021. Chinese companies became the largest transshippers of coalition products to Russia, helping circumvent Western sanctions through elaborate supply chains. However, China simultaneously maintained extensive economic relationships with European and American markets worth over $800 billion annually. This balancing act allowed China to support Russia economically while avoiding direct confrontation with Western sanctions regimes. The Global South's response revealed how the conflict divided developing nations in unexpected ways. Many countries refused Western pressure to impose sanctions on Russia, instead choosing pragmatic policies that served their economic interests. India increased Russian oil imports by over 400% between 2022 and 2024, taking advantage of discounted prices while maintaining relationships with Western partners. Brazil, South Africa, and other major emerging economies adopted similar approaches, creating parallel economic systems that operated outside Western financial structures. New military alliances emerged as traditional security arrangements proved insufficient for evolving threats. The AUKUS partnership between Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States expanded beyond submarine technology to include artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and hypersonic weapons development. Japan and South Korea strengthened defense cooperation agreements with both the United States and each other, creating overlapping security commitments across the Indo-Pacific region. The Quad partnership involving Australia, India, Japan, and the United States developed from diplomatic coordination to active military planning and joint exercises. Alternative international payment systems developed rapidly as sanctions highlighted vulnerabilities in dollar-dominated financial networks. Russia's exclusion from SWIFT messaging services accelerated development of alternative systems, including China's CIPS platform and Russia's SPFS network. Central bank digital currencies gained momentum as countries sought payment mechanisms independent of Western financial infrastructure. Bilateral trade agreements using local currencies expanded significantly, with Russia and China conducting increasing portions of their trade in rubles and yuan rather than dollars. Nuclear weapons returned to mainstream political discourse after decades of relative obscurity. Putin's repeated nuclear threats throughout 2022 and 2023 forced Western leaders to address scenarios they had not seriously considered since the 1980s. Military planners across NATO countries updated nuclear response protocols and communication systems. Public discussions about nuclear deterrence, escalation ladders, and first-use policies became regular features of political debate. These transformations created a multipolar world order where no single power could dictate global outcomes. The United States maintained significant influence, but could no longer assume automatic compliance with its policy preferences. China's economic leverage grew as countries sought alternatives to Western financial systems. Russia's energy exports, despite sanctions, continued reaching global markets through increasingly complex networks. European unity strengthened in some areas while revealing persistent divisions in others. The complexity of these new relationships makes any negotiated settlement extraordinarily difficult to achieve. Multiple competing power centers must now coordinate positions on issues ranging from sanctions, relief, to security guarantees. Countries that previously aligned automatically with American preferences now calculate independent positions based on their specific interests. Regional powers like Turkey, India, and Saudi Arabia leverage their strategic positions to extract concessions from multiple sides simultaneously. Yet beneath all these diplomatic maneuvers and military buildups, the most decisive battles were being fought through entirely different means. The real weapons that would determine this conflict's outcome weren't found in any arsenal. The energy war that changed everything. Energy became the most powerful weapon deployed by either side, capable of inflicting damage that conventional military operations could never achieve. The numbers reveal just how devastating this invisible battlefield became for both sides and the entire global economy. Russia's weaponization of natural gas supplies during winter 2022 created immediate crisis conditions across European markets. Natural gas prices spiked by over 400% compared to pre-war levels, with the Dutch TTF benchmark reaching record highs that forced governments across the continent to implement emergency consumer protection measures. Household energy bills increased so dramatically that countries like Germany allocated over 200 billion euros in subsidies to prevent mass bankruptcies among both residential and commercial users. Industrial manufacturers that relied on cheap Russian gas suddenly faced production costs that made their operations economically unviable, forcing factory shutdowns across sectors from chemicals to steel production. The winter months revealed just how thoroughly Europe had become dependent on Russian energy supplies. Germany received approximately 40% of its natural gas from Russian sources before the war, while some Eastern European countries imported over 80% of their gas from Russia. This dependency created leverage that Putin exploited systematically, threatening supply cuts to individual countries that supported Ukrainian resistance. The psychological impact proved as significant as the economic damage, as European populations faced the prospect of choosing between heating their homes and supporting Ukraine militarily. Critical energy infrastructure became targets for sabotage operations that remain unsolved mysteries today. The Nord Stream pipeline explosions in September 2022 eliminated a major supply route carrying Russian gas directly to German markets through the Baltic Sea. These underwater explosions caused massive environmental damage and completely severed physical connections that had taken years to construct. The incident demonstrated how vulnerable modern energy infrastructure had become to deliberate attacks, forcing countries to reassess the security of their critical supply systems. Ukraine shifted the energy war directly onto Russian territory through systematic targeting of oil refineries and production facilities. Beginning in 2024, Ukrainian forces launched drone attacks against refineries in regions including Saratov and Volgograd, causing significant damage to facilities that generated billions of dollars in annual revenue for the Russian state. These strikes forced Russia to divert air defense systems and military personnel to protect energy infrastructure rather than supporting frontline operations. A journalistic investigation estimated in March 2025 that Ukrainian strikes on Russia's energy sector have caused at least 60 billion rubles in damage, equivalent to approximately $714 million in direct financial losses. The global scramble for alternative energy supplies created permanent changes in international markets that extend far beyond the conflict itself. European nations competed desperately for available LNG shipments, driving prices to levels that made American and Qatari suppliers extremely profitable while forcing European consumers to pay unprecedented costs. Germany constructed new LNG terminals in months rather than the years such projects typically require, spending billions to create infrastructure that could receive tanker shipments from global suppliers. European renewable energy programs accelerated by approximately 10 years as governments treated energy independence as an immediate national security priority. Solar panel installations across Germany increased by over 200% between 2022 and 2024, while wind farm construction accelerated to levels that strained manufacturing capacity for turbines and installation equipment. Countries that had planned gradual transitions to renewable sources suddenly allocated massive budgets to crash programs designed to reduce fossil fuel dependence as quickly as possible. Russia's pivot toward Asian energy markets required massive infrastructure investments that generated revenue far below European market prices. The Power of Siberia pipeline system expanded to increase gas deliveries to China, but Chinese negotiators secured prices significantly lower than Russia had previously obtained from European customers. New pipeline construction to India and other Asian markets required billions in upfront investment while generating uncertain long-term returns. Energy sanctions created parallel global markets where Russian oil sold at substantial discounts to buyers willing to circumvent Western restrictions. The G7 price cap mechanism attempted to limit Russian crude oil prices to $60 per barrel, but Russia developed complex workarounds using what analysts call the shadow fleet of tankers. These vessels, often registered under flags of convenience and operated through shell companies, transported Russian oil to buyers in China, India, and other countries that refused to participate in sanctions regimes. Underground networks emerged involving dozens of countries and hundreds of shell companies designed to obscure the origins and destinations of Russian energy exports. These networks operated through intermediaries registered in countries with minimal regulatory oversight, creating paper trails that made enforcement of sanctions extremely difficult. Front companies purchased Russian oil and gas, then resold the same products to European buyers at market prices while concealing their Russian origins. The effectiveness of energy warfare exceeded conventional military operations in determining the conflict's trajectory and long-term consequences. Economic disruption from energy price spikes created political pressure on European governments that military casualties alone could not achieve. Russia's ability to fund military operations became increasingly constrained as energy revenues declined due to sanctions and reduced market access, creating fiscal pressures that conventional military attacks could not generate. But while Russia wielded energy as a weapon, something unexpected was happening on the other side of this conflict. The country that everyone predicted would collapse within days was undergoing a transformation that would reshape military thinking worldwide. Ukraine's transformation into a military powerhouse. Ukraine's military transformation began with forces that Western intelligence agencies gave 3 days to survive. In February 2022, Ukraine's armed forces consisted of approximately 200,000 active personnel equipped with largely Soviet-era equipment and organized according to outdated command structures. Military analysts across NATO countries predicted rapid collapse once Russian forces crossed the border. Those predictions proved catastrophically wrong. By 2025, Ukraine operates over 800,000 battle-hardened soldiers, representing Europe's most experienced military force, having fought more high-intensity combat operations than any Western military since World War II. Western training programs transformed Ukrainian military capabilities through unprecedented coordination across multiple countries. Training operations expanded beyond traditional military partnerships to create integrated programs spanning Poland, Germany, the United Kingdom, and the United States. These programs brought Ukrainian forces up to NATO operational standards through intensive courses covering everything from small unit tactics to brigade-level coordination. Ukrainian soldiers received training on Western equipment systems, communication protocols, and combined arms operations that integrated different military branches effectively. The scale exceeded anything attempted during the Cold War, with thousands of Ukrainian personnel cycling through training facilities monthly. The training network created NATO-standard Ukrainian brigades capable of operating seamlessly with Western military units. Ukrainian forces learned to coordinate artillery strikes using Western fire control systems, conduct air-ground integration with NATO aircraft, and execute complex battlefield maneuvers according to Western doctrine. These capabilities proved decisive during major Ukrainian counteroffensives in 2022 and 2023, where Ukrainian units demonstrated tactical proficiency that surprised even their Western trainers. The effectiveness became evident through Ukrainian success in combined arms operations that required precise coordination between infantry, armor, artillery, and air support elements. Ukrainian defense production underwent remarkable expansion that rivals major international defense contractors. By June 2025, Ukraine's domestic drone production capacity reached thousands of units monthly, representing a complete transformation from minimal pre-war manufacturing capabilities. Ukrainian companies developed production lines for various drone types, including reconnaissance platforms, attack drones, and specialized systems for electronic warfare applications. This production surge occurred despite ongoing combat operations and infrastructure damage, demonstrating remarkable industrial resilience and adaptation. Ukrainian drone manufacturing now supplies not only domestic military requirements, but also generates export revenue through sales to allied nations. The integration of Western weapon systems fundamentally altered Ukrainian military capabilities across all operational domains. High-mobility artillery rocket systems provided precision strike capabilities that allowed Ukrainian forces to target Russian command posts, ammunition depots, and communication centers with accuracy previously impossible. F-16 fighter jets, delivered through international cooperation agreements, brought air-to-air combat capabilities and precision ground attack options that challenged Russian air superiority. Advanced air defense systems, including Patriot missiles and NASAMS platforms, created protective umbrellas over critical Ukrainian infrastructure and military installations. These weapon systems required extensive training programs and logistics support that created lasting changes in Ukrainian military organization. Ukrainian maintenance personnel learned to service complex Western equipment using NATO supply chains and technical procedures. Ukrainian pilots underwent intensive training programs to master F-16 operations, while ground crews learned to conduct rapid turnaround operations under combat conditions. The integration process created Ukrainian military units that operated according to Western standards while maintaining tactical flexibility suited to local combat conditions. Ukrainian forces demonstrated mastery of electronic warfare and cyber operations that often exceeded Russian capabilities despite having limited experience in these domains before 2022. Ukrainian electronic warfare units learned to jam Russian communication systems, disrupt drone operations, and interfere with precision-guided munitions targeting systems. Ukrainian cyber operations targeted Russian military networks, logistics systems, and command structures with increasing sophistication throughout the conflict. These capabilities developed through intensive cooperation with Western intelligence agencies and technology companies that provided training and equipment support. Ukrainian forces adapted Western tactics to local conditions through innovative approaches that created hybrid warfare doctrine combining conventional and unconventional methods. Ukrainian military units learned to integrate Western combined arms tactics with local knowledge of terrain, weather conditions, and Russian operational patterns. This adaptation created tactical approaches that maximized the effectiveness of Western equipment while accounting for specific battlefield conditions in Ukraine. Ukrainian forces developed techniques for urban warfare, defensive operations, and counteroffensive planning that incorporated lessons learned from Western training with practical combat experience. Intelligence sharing agreements provided Ukraine with near real-time battlefield awareness that rivaled capabilities available to major NATO powers. These agreements allowed Ukrainian forces to access satellite imagery, electronic intelligence, and communication intercepts that provided detailed information about Russian force movements, logistics operations, and planned attacks. Ukrainian commanders received intelligence briefings that enabled them to anticipate Russian operations and position their forces accordingly. This intelligence advantage proved decisive in numerous engagements, where Ukrainian forces successfully ambushed Russian units or avoided planned attacks. Ukrainian innovation in drone warfare influenced military thinking globally and established new paradigms for unmanned systems employment. Ukrainian forces developed naval drones capable of attacking major Russian warships, demonstrating that relatively inexpensive unmanned systems could threaten high-value naval assets. Ukrainian artificial intelligence integration allowed drones to operate autonomously in contested environments where communication jamming would disable remotely piloted systems. These innovations attracted attention from military planners worldwide who recognized that Ukrainian combat experience provided insights into future warfare requirements. The transformation from a military expected to collapse within days, to Europe's most experienced fighting force represents one of the most remarkable military developments in modern history. But this military transformation was only possible because of another battlefield entirely, one where the real war for survival was being fought through the economic fortress and supply under siege, rather than Russia's economy became the ultimate battlefield where the war's outcome would truly be determined. While military operations captured global attention, economic warfare proved far more devastating than conventional weapons could ever achieve. The numbers reveal a systematic campaign to destroy Russia's financial foundations that exceeded anything attempted since World War II sanctions regimes. Sanctions evolved from targeted measures against specific individuals to comprehensive economic warfare affecting approximately 60% of Russian GDP by 2024. The initial sanctions packages in February and March 2022 focused on freezing assets belonging to Russian leadership and blocking access to international banking systems. However, as the conflict intensified, Western nations expanded restrictions to cover entire economic sectors, including energy, technology, manufacturing, and transportation. By January 2024, over 16,000 restrictions had been placed on Russian individuals and entities, making Russia the most sanctioned country in global history. The banking sector faced particularly devastating restrictions that crippled Russia's ability to conduct international transactions. Approximately 70% of assets within the Russian banking system fell under sanctions by 2024, effectively isolating major Russian financial institutions from global markets. The exclusion of Russian banks from SWIFT messaging systems disrupted routine commercial transactions and forced Russian companies to develop alternative payment mechanisms. Russian businesses found themselves unable to access letters of credit, international wire transfers, and other standard banking services that modern commerce requires. Russia's foreign currency reserves dropped catastrophically from $630 billion before the invasion to under $200 billion in accessible funds by 2025. Western countries froze approximately $300 billion in Russian central bank assets held in their jurisdictions, creating immediate liquidity problems for the Russian government. These frozen reserves had previously provided financial stability and international credibility for Russian economic policy. The loss of access to these funds forced Russia to rely primarily on revenues from energy exports and gold sales to finance government operations and military expenditures. The exodus of Western companies created massive disruptions across Russian consumer markets and industrial supply chains. Over 1,000 Western companies suspended or terminated operations in Russia between 2022 and 2024, representing a complete reversal of decades of international business integration. Major corporations including McDonald's, Coca-Cola, Apple, and General Motors withdrew from Russian markets, leaving behind facilities, employees, and established distribution networks. Russian authorities responded by seizing abandoned foreign assets and creating parallel substitutes operated by Russian companies or friendly foreign partners. Russia's pivot to a wartime economy created unsustainable inflation and severe labor shortages that threatened long-term economic stability. Military production consumed increasing portions of industrial capacity and raw materials, driving up prices for civilian goods and services. The Russian central bank raised interest rates to 21% by February 2025 in desperate attempts to combat inflation, but these measures further constrained business investment and consumer spending. Labor markets faced unprecedented disruptions as military mobilization removed hundreds of thousands of workers from productive economic activities. The Center for European Policy Analysis estimated that between 10,000 and 30,000 workers join the army every month, about 0.5% of the total supply. This drain on human resources created critical shortages in sectors requiring skilled labor, including manufacturing, construction, and technology services. Companies across Russia reported difficulty finding qualified personnel to maintain operations and implement expansion plans. The brain drain accelerated these labor market problems, as over 500,000 educated Russians fled the country to avoid mobilization and economic collapse. These emigrants included engineers, programmers, researchers, and other professionals whose skills were essential for maintaining technological competitiveness. The departure of highly educated workers created knowledge gaps that Russian companies struggled to fill through domestic training programs or foreign recruitment. Cryptocurrency and barter systems emerged as Russian businesses sought methods to circumvent banking restrictions and maintain international commerce. Russian companies increasingly used digital currencies to conduct transactions, with foreign partners willing to accept these payment methods. Barter arrangements allowed Russian exporters to exchange commodities directly for needed imports without involving traditional banking systems. These alternative payment mechanisms proved cumbersome and expensive compared to conventional financial services, but provided the only viable options for many international transactions. Regional Russian economies collapsed while Moscow maintained artificial stability through massive government spending programs. Cities and regions dependent on specific industries or international trade experienced severe economic contractions as sanctions disrupted their primary revenue sources. Regional governments struggled to provide basic services as tax revenues declined and federal transfers failed to compensate for lost economic activity. The government attempted to maintain economic stability through fiscal spending that stimulated short-term growth while creating long-term sustainability problems. Salaries increased by 17.8% in nominal terms and 8.7% in real terms during 2024 compared to the previous year. Disposable incomes rose by 7.3% in 2024, achieving growth rates not seen in almost 2 decades. However, these increases came from government spending rather than productive economic activity, creating fiscal deficits that required continued energy export revenues to sustain. Russia's economic resilience demonstrated remarkable short-term adaptation capabilities, but structural problems indicated that sustainability limits were approaching critical thresholds by 2025. The wartime economy generated artificial growth through military production and government spending while undermining long-term competitiveness and technological development. Yet behind all these economic statistics and policy debates lay consequences that governments on both sides worked desperately to conceal from their populations. The human cost nobody talks about. The casualties and displacement figures tell only part of a much larger human catastrophe that extends far beyond battlefield statistics. Behind every military number lies a human story that governments prefer to keep hidden, revealing damage that will shape both nations for decades to come. Russian military casualties have reached levels that dwarf official government acknowledgments. By June 2025, estimates suggest that over 790,000 Russian military personnel have been killed or injured in the conflict, a figure that the Kremlin desperately tries to conceal. Missing in action numbers are estimated around 48,000, representing soldiers whose fates remain unknown to their families and whose disappearances create lasting uncertainty for thousands of Russian households. Russian authorities strictly control information about military casualties, forbidding local media from reporting death tolls and prosecuting journalists who attempt to investigate casualty figures independently. These military losses have accelerated Russia's existing demographic crisis into a full-scale catastrophe. Over 800,000 people have left Russia for economic or political reasons since 2022, creating a mass exodus that includes engineers, doctors, teachers, and technology workers whose skills are essential for maintaining modern economic functions. Countries including Georgia, Armenia, Kazakhstan, and European Union nations have experienced significant increases in Russian immigrants seeking to avoid military mobilization and economic instability. These immigrants often cannot return to Russia due to legal restrictions or fear of prosecution, creating permanent population losses that will affect Russian society for generations. Ukrainian civilian casualties present an equally devastating picture that reveals the systematic targeting of non-combatants throughout the conflict. Ukrainian civilian fatalities have reached 13,000 as of June 10, 2025, with the actual number likely being much higher due to ongoing investigations and areas where access remains limited. The attacks have resulted in the effective erasure of entire cities, such as Mariupol, where widespread destruction and loss of life have been documented through satellite imagery and survivor testimonies. More than 2.5 million homes across Ukraine, representing 13% of the housing stock, have been damaged or destroyed, leaving many Ukrainians in damaged homes or in buildings ill-prepared for life-threatening freezing temperatures. The energy crisis is disrupting public access to water, electricity, heating, healthcare, education, and social protection. Entire neighborhoods in cities like Kharkiv, Kherson, and Zaporizhia have been reduced to rubble, forcing residents to live in basements and bomb shelters for months at a time. The refugee crisis has scattered over 6.9 million Ukrainians across Europe and beyond, creating the largest displacement of people in Europe since World War II. Poland has welcomed the largest number of Ukrainian refugees, hosting approximately 956,635 as of December 15, 2023. Ukrainian families face impossible choices between staying in dangerous areas to maintain their homes and livelihoods, or abandoning everything to seek safety elsewhere. Many refugees live in temporary accommodations that were never designed for long-term habitation, creating psychological stress and uncertainty about their futures. The psychological trauma affecting an entire generation of children who have grown up during wartime will require decades of specialized treatment and support. Ukrainian children have experienced constant air raid sirens, displacement from their homes, separation from family members, and witnessing destruction of their communities. Many children suffer from sleep disorders, anxiety, and developmental problems that will require long-term therapeutic intervention. Schools across Ukraine operate in bomb shelters and underground facilities, creating learning environments that reflect the constant threat of attack. Russian children also face psychological challenges as family members deploy to combat zones or disappear during mobilization campaigns. Russian families experience the stress of not knowing whether their relatives will return safely, while government restrictions on information make it difficult to obtain accurate updates about military operations. The secrecy surrounding military casualties means many Russian families live in uncertainty about missing relatives for months or years. Families have been torn apart across both countries, creating lasting social wounds that extend far beyond immediate military impacts. Russian mothers have organized protest movements against mobilization policies, despite facing arrest and prosecution for their activities. These protests represent rare public dissent in Russia and demonstrate how military casualties affect civilian populations who lack official channels for expressing their concerns. Ukrainian families work to rebuild their lives from nothing after losing homes, businesses, and community connections that took generations to establish. The demographic impacts of this conflict will shape both societies for decades to come. Russia faces labor shortages, population decline, and the loss of educated professionals that will constrain economic growth and social development. Ukraine confronts the challenge of rebuilding destroyed communities, while many of its most productive citizens remain scattered across other countries. Yet while these human costs mounted across both nations, another revolution was quietly unfolding that would prove equally transformative. The methods being used to fight this war were fundamentally different from any conflict in human history, establishing entirely new rules for how battles would be won and lost. The technology war reshaping modern combat. Commercial satellites provided intelligence capabilities that rivaled the most sophisticated military reconnaissance systems available to major powers. Companies like Planet Labs and Maxar Technologies delivered hourly imagery updates that allowed Ukrainian forces to track Russian troop movements, identify supply convoys, and monitor construction activities across occupied territories. These commercial satellite constellations offered coverage that exceeded what traditional military satellites could provide through their scheduled orbital patterns. Ukrainian commanders received intelligence briefings based on satellite imagery that was often more current than information available to Russian forces about their own operations. The satellite intelligence revolution democratized battlefield awareness in ways that fundamentally altered military planning and execution. Ukrainian forces used commercial satellite imagery to identify Russian ammunition depots, command centers, and defensive positions that became targets for precision strikes. The constant surveillance made it nearly impossible for Russian forces to conduct large-scale troop movements without detection, forcing them to adopt defensive strategies that limited their operational flexibility. Russian military planners found themselves operating under conditions where their adversaries possessed superior situational awareness despite having significantly smaller intelligence budgets. Drone technology transformed battlefield dynamics by making $500 quadcopters as dangerous as million-dollar missile systems. Ukrainian forces adapted commercial drones for military purposes through modifications that cost hundreds of dollars, while achieving effects that previously required expensive guided munitions. These modified drones could deliver explosive payloads with precision targeting that allowed small Ukrainian units to destroy Russian armored vehicles, artillery positions, and supply convoys. The proliferation of drone technology meant that individual soldiers could conduct strikes that previously required coordination between multiple military units and specialized equipment. The drone revolution extended beyond tactical applications to strategic operations that influenced the broader conflict trajectory. Ukrainian forces developed long-range drone capabilities that could strike targets hundreds of kilometers inside Russian territory using relatively simple technology and minimal resources. Russian forces launched 267 drones in a single night during February 2025, demonstrating how drone warfare had become central to military operations rather than a supplementary capability. The mass production and deployment of drones created new logistical challenges, as both sides required thousands of replacement units monthly to sustain operations. Artificial intelligence began selecting targets and coordinating attacks with minimal human oversight, introducing automation into warfare decisions that previously required extensive human analysis. Ukrainian forces integrated AI systems that could identify Russian military vehicles, personnel concentrations, and equipment signatures from drone footage in real time. These AI systems processed vast amounts of visual data and recommended targets based on predetermined criteria, allowing Ukrainian commanders to execute strikes more rapidly than traditional targeting processes permitted. The speed of AI-assisted targeting created tactical advantages that forced Russian forces to adopt dispersed formations and irregular movement patterns. Cyber warfare campaigns targeted everything from power grids to individual smartphones, creating vulnerabilities that extended far beyond traditional military targets. Russian cyber operations attempted to disable Ukrainian government websites, disrupt communication networks, and interfere with civilian infrastructure, including electrical distribution systems and water treatment facilities. Ukrainian cyber capabilities responded with attacks against Russian government networks, banking systems, and industrial control systems that managed critical infrastructure. The cyber domain became a parallel battlefield where operations occurred continuously rather than during specific military campaigns. Social media became both a weapon and a battlefield that shaped global public opinion and influenced international support for the conflict. Ukrainian government officials used social media platforms to document Russian attacks, share battlefield updates, and maintain international attention on their situation. Russian information operations attempted to spread disinformation about Ukrainian military capabilities, civilian casualties, and international support levels. The battle for narrative control occurred across multiple social media platforms, where both sides competed to influence perceptions among domestic and international audiences. Electronic warfare created an arms race that rendered some advanced Western systems temporarily obsolete, as both sides developed countermeasures against enemy capabilities. Russian forces deployed jamming systems that interfered with GPS navigation, communications equipment, and drone control signals used by Ukrainian forces. Ukrainian electronic warfare capabilities disrupted Russian communications networks and interfered with precision-guided munitions that relied on electronic navigation systems. The rapid development of electronic countermeasures forced both sides to continuously upgrade their equipment and tactics. three-dimensional printing and rapid manufacturing changed battlefield logistics by enabling local production of needed equipment and replacement parts. Ukrainian forces used 3D printing to produce drone components, repair parts for Western equipment, and specialized tools required for military operations. The distributed manufacturing capability reduced dependence on traditional supply chains that were vulnerable to interdiction and attack. Space-based assets became legitimate military targets for the first time since the Cold War, as both sides recognized the critical importance of satellite communications and navigation systems. The targeting of space assets represented a significant escalation in the types of infrastructure considered acceptable military targets. This technological transformation established new warfare paradigms that extended far beyond military applications. The same innovations that revolutionized combat operations also disrupted global systems that billions of people depended on for their most basic needs. The global food crisis hidden in plain sight. Food shortages spreading across continents revealed how a European conflict could threaten basic survival for populations thousands of miles from any battlefield. Ukraine and Russia's combined agricultural exports fed over 400 million people globally before February 2022, making these two countries absolutely critical to international food security. Ukraine alone accounted for approximately 10% of global wheat exports, while Russia contributed another 18% of world wheat supplies. Together, these nations provided nearly 30% of internationally traded wheat, along with significant portions of corn, barley, and sunflower oil that reached markets across Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. The naval blockade implemented by Russian forces trapped approximately 20 million tons of Ukrainian grain in Black Sea ports during the critical harvest period of 2022. Ukrainian farmers had successfully completed their spring planting and summer harvest despite ongoing military operations. But the grain sat in storage facilities and port terminals, while ships could not safely navigate the Black Sea due to naval mines and active combat operations. The trapped grain represented enough food to feed tens of millions of people for months. Yet it remained inaccessible to international markets that desperately needed these supplies. Port facilities in Odessa, Kornomorsk, and other Ukrainian coastal cities operated at minimal capacity, while global food prices increased dramatically. Fertilizer shortages created by sanctions against Russia and Belarus reduced global crop yields by approximately 15%, compounding the direct supply disruptions caused by the conflict itself. Russia and Belarus together accounted for about 40% of global potash exports, a critical component in fertilizer production that farmers worldwide depend on to maximize their crop yields. The sanctions designed to pressure these countries economically had unintended consequences for agricultural production across continents, as farmers from Brazil to India struggled to obtain adequate fertilizer supplies for their planting seasons. The reduced fertilizer availability forced farmers to choose between paying dramatically higher prices or accepting lower crop yields that would contribute to food shortages. Food price spikes triggered political instability across Africa and the Middle East as governments struggled to maintain affordable food supplies for their populations. Wheat prices increased by over 50% in international markets during the first 6 months of the conflict, while corn and cooking oil prices reached levels that made basic nutrition unaffordable for millions of people in developing countries. Countries including Egypt, Lebanon, and Tunisia, which imported substantial portions of their grain from Ukraine and Russia, faced immediate crisis conditions as their traditional suppliers became unreliable. The price increases created social tensions that manifested in protests, strikes, and political upheaval across multiple countries simultaneously. The grain corridor agreements negotiated through Turkish and United Nations mediation became diplomatic chess pieces that both sides manipulated to achieve broader political objectives. These agreements allowed limited Ukrainian grain exports through carefully monitored sea lanes, but the arrangements remained vulnerable to political tensions and military developments that had nothing to do with humanitarian food assistance. Russia periodically suspended participation in the grain corridor agreements when seeking leverage in other aspects of the conflict. demonstrating how food assistance had become subordinated to military strategy. Climate change combined with war disruptions to create perfect storm conditions for famine across multiple regions simultaneously. Drought conditions in East Africa, flooding in Pakistan, and extreme weather events in other agricultural regions occurred at the same time as the Ukrainian grain shortage, multiplying the impact of each individual crisis. Countries that might have managed one agricultural disruption found themselves unable to cope with simultaneous challenges to their food security. Alternative supply chains emerged as countries scrambled to replace Ukrainian and Russian agricultural imports, permanently reshaping global food trade patterns. India increased wheat exports significantly to fill gaps in international markets, while countries including Argentina and Australia expanded their agricultural export programs to meet increased demand. These alternative suppliers often charged higher prices than Ukrainian and Russian exporters had previously offered, creating permanent increases in food costs for importing countries. The development of new trade relationships also required infrastructure investments and logistical arrangements that took months to establish, while populations faced immediate food shortages. Food became a weapon of war as both sides manipulated agricultural exports to achieve political and military objectives. Russia used its grain exports as leverage in negotiations with countries that might otherwise support Ukraine, offering discounted food supplies in exchange for diplomatic neutrality or support. Ukraine sought to maintain its agricultural exports as a source of foreign currency revenue needed to fund its military operations, creating tensions between humanitarian needs and wartime financing requirements. The hunger crisis extended this conflict's impact to every continent through food price increases that affected even countries with minimal direct involvement in the war. Agricultural commodity markets operate globally, meaning that supply disruptions in one region immediately influence prices worldwide. Countries in Latin America, Asia, and Africa experienced food inflation that reduced living standards and created social tensions despite having no direct stake in the territorial disputes that caused the original conflict. Yet even as millions faced hunger because of this war, an even more terrifying weapon loomed over every strategic calculation. The threat that had defined the Cold War was returning to haunt a new generation of world leaders. The nuclear shadow such dangers over everything belonged to history. Putin's nuclear threats escalated from diplomatic subtlety to explicit intimidation designed to paralyze Western decision-making throughout the conflict. The progression began with vague references to Russia's nuclear capabilities during the initial invasion, escalated to specific warnings about consequences for countries providing military aid to Ukraine, and culminated in direct threats against NATO territories. By December 2022, Putin explicitly stated that Russia would use all available means to defend territories it considered Russian, language that military analysts interpreted as nuclear threats against any attempt to liberate occupied Ukrainian regions. The rhetoric intensified throughout 2023 and 2024 as Western military aid increased, and Ukrainian forces demonstrated growing effectiveness against Russian positions. Russian officials, including Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and former President Dmitry Medvedev, made increasingly explicit statements about nuclear weapon use in response to specific Western actions. These threats targeted not only Ukraine, but also NATO countries hosting Ukrainian training programs, weapons production facilities, and logistical support operations. The escalation in language created an atmosphere where nuclear weapons became regular topics of international diplomatic discussions rather than theoretical deterrence concepts. Russia's deployment of tactical nuclear weapons to Belarus represented the most significant nuclear positioning change in Europe since the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. The weapons arrived in Belarus during summer 2023, placing nuclear assets within striking distance of major European capitals, including Warsaw, Berlin, and the Baltic states. This deployment shortened potential flight times for nuclear strikes against NATO territories to minutes rather than the hours that intercontinental ballistic missiles would require. The placement of these weapons created new strategic calculations for NATO defense planners who had to account for nuclear threats originating from multiple directions simultaneously. Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko confirmed the deployment while emphasizing that Russian personnel maintained operational control over the weapon systems. This arrangement created ambiguity about command, authority, and decision-making processes that complicated Western intelligence assessments of nuclear escalation risks. The proximity of these weapons to NATO borders forced alliance members to reconsider their defense postures and emergency response procedures for potential nuclear incidents. Nuclear power plant attacks introduced radiological terrorism as a new dimension of the conflict that threatened catastrophic civilian consequences across Europe. Russian forces occupied the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant in March 2022, creating immediate fears about reactor safety and potential radiation releases. Shelling around the facility throughout 2022 and 2023 damaged electrical systems and backup power supplies that are essential for maintaining reactor cooling systems. International Atomic Energy Agency inspectors documented multiple incidents where combat operations created conditions that could have led to reactor meltdowns similar to the Chernobyl disaster. The Chernobyl exclusion zone itself became a battlefield early in the conflict as Russian forces occupied the site and disrupted monitoring systems that track radiation levels. The combination of military operations around active nuclear facilities and the occupation of contaminated zones created unprecedented scenarios that international nuclear safety protocols had never addressed. European governments prepared emergency response plans for potential radiological emergencies, while populations in downwind areas faced the possibility of radiation exposure from combat-related nuclear accidents. Nuclear doctrine modifications by both sides lowered thresholds for potential nuclear weapon use in ways that increased escalation risks significantly. Russia's updated nuclear doctrine incorporated language about defending territories that it claims is Russian, effectively extending nuclear deterrence to occupied Ukrainian regions. This doctrinal change implied that Russian leadership might consider nuclear responses to Ukrainian attempts to liberate their own internationally recognized territories. The doctrine also specified that attacks on Russian command and control systems could trigger nuclear responses, creating restrictions on Ukrainian targeting that had not existed in previous conflicts. Global nuclear modernization programs accelerated as countries worldwide reassessed their security requirements based on lessons from the Ukraine conflict. China expanded its nuclear arsenal significantly throughout 2023 and 2024, moving from approximately 400 warheads to over 500 according to Pentagon estimates. India and Pakistan both increased their nuclear weapons production while developing new delivery systems designed to penetrate advanced missile defense systems. France and the United Kingdom announced major investments in nuclear weapon modernization programs that had been delayed for budgetary reasons in previous years. Nuclear command and control systems faced unprecedented cyber and electronic warfare attacks that created new vulnerabilities for nuclear weapon safety and security. Russian cyber capabilities targeted NATO communication systems that could affect nuclear decision-making processes during crisis situations. The electronic warfare environment in Ukraine demonstrated how modern military operations could disrupt the satellite communications and secure networks that nuclear command systems depend on for reliable operation. Behind-the-scenes diplomatic efforts to prevent nuclear escalation involved continuous communication between nuclear powers that the public rarely saw, but that proved essential for crisis management. The Biden administration maintained direct communication channels with Russian leadership throughout the conflict despite public disagreements about military aid and sanctions policies. These diplomatic contacts focused specifically on preventing nuclear escalation rather than resolving the broader conflict, reflecting how nuclear risks had become separate from conventional military objectives. Nuclear weapons now cast shadows over every strategic decision in this conflict, creating constraints and considerations that affect military planning, diplomatic negotiations, and international support for Ukraine. Yet these nuclear threats serve a deeper purpose than mere intimidation. They reveal how completely Putin's political survival has become dependent on achieving victory in Ukraine, regardless of the cost. Why Putin cannot afford to lose. The stakes surrounding this conflict have reached levels where retreat represents political suicide for Putin and his entire leadership structure. What began as a military operation designed to achieve limited territorial objectives has transformed into an existential struggle where backing down would likely trigger the collapse of Putin's government. The regime successfully framed this war as a defense against Western attempts to destroy Russia itself, creating conditions where any compromise appears as national betrayal rather than pragmatic diplomacy. Putin's domestic legitimacy became entirely dependent on achieving victory in Ukraine through a propaganda campaign that portrayed the conflict as Russia's most important struggle since World War II. Russian state media consistently presents the war as defending Russian civilization against Western aggression designed to fragment and weaken Russia permanently. This narrative resonates with Russian populations who experienced the chaos and humiliation of the 1990s following the Soviet collapse. The regime invested enormous political capital in convincing Russians that Ukraine represented an existential threat requiring unlimited commitment and sacrifice. Television programming regularly features experts explaining how Ukrainian victory would lead to Russian territorial losses, economic collapse, and international humiliation. Educational institutions received directives to incorporate themes about the conflict's importance into curricula across subjects, from history to literature. Religious institutions received guidance on presenting the war as a moral struggle between Russian traditional values and Western decadence. The conflict became intertwined with Russian national identity through narratives that present Ukraine as an artificial state created by Western powers to weaken Russia. Massive financial commitments make backing down economically catastrophic for Russia given the scale of resources already expended on military operations. The government abandoned its self-imposed spending limits and now dedicates nearly all oil revenue to sustaining military objectives rather than building long-term economic reserves. Defense spending increased by over 70% between 2022 and 2024, representing approximately 6% of gross domestic product. These expenditures cover direct military costs, payments to military families, veteran benefits, and industrial subsidies required to sustain wartime production levels. The economic distortions created by wartime spending generate artificial growth in defense-related industries, while most civilian sectors stagnate or decline. Investment patterns shifted dramatically toward military production facilities, weapons manufacturing, and supporting infrastructure that served no peacetime economic function. Companies throughout Russia retooled their operations to produce military equipment, ammunition, and supplies needed for sustained combat operations. Reversing these investments would require massive economic restructuring that could trigger widespread unemployment and business failures across regions dependent on defense spending. War crimes investigations create personal legal jeopardy for Russian leadership that makes retreat extremely dangerous for individual survival. The International Criminal Court issued arrest warrants for Putin and other high-ranking officials based on evidence of systematic attacks against civilian targets and forced deportation of Ukrainian children. These investigations continue expanding as investigators document additional evidence of deliberate targeting of hospitals, schools, and residential areas throughout occupied territories. The legal exposure means that Putin and his associates face potential prosecution if they lose power or if Russia experiences regime change. The personal legal risks extend beyond international courts to potential domestic prosecutions if Putin's government collapses. Russian opposition figures and civil society organizations have documented evidence of corruption, human rights violations, and abuse of power that could form the basis for criminal charges under a different government. International sanctions have frozen billions in assets belonging to Putin's associates, creating powerful incentives to continue fighting until those sanctions are lifted. Russian military and intelligence agencies gained unprecedented power and influence through the conflict, creating institutional momentum that favors continued fighting over negotiated settlement. The Federal Security Service expanded its authority over civilian institutions, including media, education, and business operations deemed relevant to national security. Military leadership received expanded budgets, personnel, and political influence that elevated their status within the Russian power structure. Defense contractors and military-industrial companies now employ millions of Russians and generate substantial profits that create powerful lobbying interests favoring continued military spending. State propaganda created public expectations that make compromise politically suicidal by presenting maximalist war aims as non-negotiable national requirements. Russian media consistently describes the conflict's objectives as liberating all Ukrainian territory from Western control and establishing a neutral Ukrainian government that acknowledges Russian security interests. These objectives were presented as minimum acceptable outcomes rather than ambitious goals, creating public expectations that anything less represents defeat and humiliation. Putin's inner circle faces personal sanctions and international exile that would end only if Russia achieves victory and forces sanctions relief through successful military outcomes. Billions in frozen assets belonging to oligarchs and senior officials create powerful financial incentives to continue fighting until Western governments lift restrictions. Regional Russian elites profit from the wartime economy despite overall economic damage through defense contracts, construction projects, and administrative positions created by military spending. For Putin's regime, this war represents survival rather than territorial expansion because the political, economic, and personal costs of failure exceed the benefits of peaceful coexistence with Ukraine and Western powers. These interlocking pressures create a situation where neither side can accept the compromises that traditional diplomacy would require, raising fundamental questions about how such a conflict could ever reach resolution. The endgame nobody wants to admit, the uncomfortable reality that nobody wants to acknowledge, is that this conflict has no clear pathway to resolution. Both sides have established maximalist goals that make meaningful negotiation essentially impossible under current conditions. Russia demands what Putin describes as Ukraine's complete neutrality, the lifting of Western sanctions, and formal guarantees that NATO will halt eastward expansion permanently. These conditions would require a written pledge from major Western powers to halt NATO's eastward expansion, which would involve formally ruling out membership for Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, and other former Soviet republics. Ukraine maintains that any settlement must involve the complete restoration of its internationally recognized borders, including Crimea and all occupied territories. The gap between these positions represents not just diplomatic disagreement, but fundamentally incompatible visions of European security architecture. The maximalist nature of both sides' objectives reflects how thoroughly this conflict has transcended its original territorial disputes to become a struggle over the future organization of global power. Russian leadership views Ukrainian independence and Western support as existential threats to Russian statehood that cannot be accommodated through compromise. Ukrainian leadership correctly recognizes that accepting Russian demands would effectively end Ukrainian sovereignty and establish precedents that would encourage further Russian expansion. Western governments face domestic pressure to maintain support for Ukraine while managing economic costs and nuclear risks that create incentives for seeking negotiated settlements. Frozen conflict scenarios provide the most likely outcome for this war, potentially persisting for decades, similar to the division of Korea or the partition of Cyprus. These historical precedents demonstrate how military stalemates can become permanent political arrangements when neither side possesses sufficient capability to achieve decisive victory. The Korean Peninsula remains divided after more than 70 years despite multiple diplomatic initiatives and changing international conditions. Cyprus continues to operate as separate political entities despite European Union membership and extensive international mediation efforts. These examples suggest that the Russia-Ukraine conflict could stabilize along current front lines while remaining technically unresolved for generations. The development of extensive defensive fortifications across occupied territories indicates that both sides already anticipate prolonged stalemate rather than decisive military resolution. Russian forces have constructed elaborate trench systems and defensive positions designed for permanent occupation rather than temporary military control. Ukrainian forces have similarly established defensive lines and logistics networks capable of sustaining long-term operations. The military infrastructure being built by both sides reflects strategic planning for conflicts measured in decades rather than months or years. Western fatigue and political changes pose significant risks to sustained Ukrainian support that could fundamentally alter the conflict's trajectory. American political developments have already created uncertainty about future military aid levels, with U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth stating that the United States intends to reduce its budget for the purchase of weapons for Ukraine in 2026. European governments face domestic pressure to reduce military spending and redirect resources toward civilian priorities, including healthcare, education, and infrastructure maintenance. Public opinion polling across Western countries shows declining enthusiasm for open-ended military commitments to Ukraine as economic costs accumulate and immediate security threats to Western territories appear minimal. Generational trauma will influence both Russian and Ukrainian societies long after active fighting ends, creating psychological and cultural barriers to reconciliation that could persist for decades. Ukrainian children have experienced years of air raid sirens, displacement, and witnessing destruction of their communities. Russian families have endured mobilization campaigns, economic hardship, and uncertainty about relatives serving in combat zones. The psychological damage affecting millions of people will require extensive therapeutic intervention and social support systems that neither country currently possesses adequate resources to provide. Economic reconstruction costs exceeding $1 trillion create massive international obligations that will strain global resources and political relationships for decades. Ukraine's electricity generating capacity fell from 56 gigawatts to an estimated 9 gigawatts by the end of 2024, with approximately 64% of Ukraine's electricity generating capacity destroyed or occupied. The scale of infrastructure damage requires international reconstruction efforts comparable to the Marshall Plan that rebuilt Europe after World War II. The financial commitments necessary for reconstruction will create ongoing political debates in donor countries, while establishing long-term economic relationships between Ukraine and international partners. Demographic and territorial changes make returning to pre-2022 conditions impossible regardless of military outcomes. Russia has gained control over 27,666 square miles of Ukrainian territory, which is 12% of Ukraine since February 2022, with total controlled territory representing 44,291 square miles, or 19% of Ukraine, including previously occupied areas. Millions of Ukrainians have relocated internally or internationally, creating population shifts that cannot be easily reversed. The refugee crisis involves 6.9 million Ukrainians as international refugees, and 3.7 million internally displaced people whose resettlement will require years of planning and resources. This war's true end may be decades away regardless of when active fighting stops, because the underlying conflicts over European security architecture, nuclear weapons proliferation, and global economic systems that triggered this crisis remain unresolved. The implications extend far beyond Ukraine's borders, reshaping fundamental assumptions about how international relations function in the modern era. Putin's 3-day military operation has fundamentally altered how power operates in the modern world. The conflict accelerated the shift toward a multipolar global order, where economic interdependence and strategic competition exist simultaneously, creating contradictions that define current international relations. Russia restructured its entire economy around military production, while China became the primary transshipper helping circumvent Western sanctions through elaborate supply chains. Understanding these dynamics becomes essential for comprehending why traditional diplomatic solutions prove inadequate for resolving contemporary conflicts. The war's ultimate resolution will establish precedents that shape international relations for generations, regardless of when active fighting eventually stops.